Poetry Magazine, a magazine of verse. Poetry Magazine was founded in October 1912 by Harriet Monroe in Chicago, Illinois, and it helped to create the culture of poetry that we know today by showcasing the work of both well-known and less-known poets in Chicago. In October 1912, the first issue of Poetry Magazine was published by Harriet Monroe, a poet born on December 23, 1860 in Chicago, Illinois. It became the first monthly magazine devoted specifically to poetry. It started off small and it required much hard work and many donations to get it off the ground, but it was a promising enough idea that Harriet Monroe was able to convince over 100 people to donate $50 each year for the following 5 years when the magazine first began. Finally, after much prep work, Poetry Magazine set off to give poets the best opportunities to share their work and to change the culture of poetry in Chicago. By 1912, cultural life in the United States was already pretty modern. The first skyscrapers had already been built, around 5 million Americans went to the movies each day, and the guidelines of American art were becoming broader and broader thanks to artists such as Matisse, Picasso, Schoenberg, and Stravinsky, along with many others. More and more poets and writers were beginning to publish their work, but before Poetry Magazine, the American poetry continued to be stuck in the 19th century and it was not as modern as other forms of art. According to sources, it remained stuck in the twilight of the 19th century and an exhausted romanticism inherited from England. Poetry Magazine was founded before the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1939, and it managed to continue to run during it and afterwards. When Poetry Magazine was first published, the President of the United States was William Howard Taft, but later that year, Woodrow Wilson was elected. During Wilson's service as president, World War I was going on as well, so of course the arts program in cities such as Chicago were not the first priorities at the time. But the mayor of Chicago in 1912 was Carter Harrison Jr. He was a big supporter of the arts in Chicago, and he managed to convince the City Council of Chicago to start a commission for the encouragement of local art. He also personally purchased many pieces of art from Chicago artists such as Victor Higgins. Also in 1912, the Radio Act of 1912 was passed by Congress, which was a United States law that said that all radio stations had to be licensed by the federal government. If that rule was broken, then fines as large as $500 would be imposed upon the radio operators. All around, people were wearing high, stiff collars. There was a lot of racism all over, and African Americans continued to be mistreated and killed. Harriet Monroe founded Poetry Magazine in 1912 to give poets of all kinds, from beginners to masters, from young to old, a place to have their poems showcased and appreciated. It started off small, but Harriet Monroe was determined and inspired, so she managed to convince 108 people to each contribute $50 a year for the next 5 years to fund the magazine, as Hobart C. Chatfield Taylor, a novelist, had suggested to her in the beginning. Poetry Magazine's mission was to print the best contemporary poetry of any style, genre, or approach. Poetry Magazine's reputation was established early on by publishing some of the first important poems by H.D., T.S. Eliot, Marianne Moore, Ezra Pound, Carl Sandburg, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, and many other authors who are now known as classic authors. It became very popular very fast, as it was the first monthly magazine devoted specifically to poetry. Poetry Magazine had a large influence on Chicagoans, and it helped to shape Chicago. It was an open-door magazine because there weren't very many strict guidelines on what you could or couldn't publish in it. Poetry Magazine pushed our poetry out of the 19th century, and it changed the world of poetry we know today. Without Poetry Magazine, we wouldn't be where we are in the world of poetry today. Poetry Magazine made it so that poets back then and right now could share their poetry and have a place to start off their potential careers as poets, and it also helped to push our poetry to become as modern as other forms of art in Chicago. As a former editor of Poetry magazine has said, American poetry is ready for something new because our poets have been writing in the same way for a long time now. There is fatigue, something stagnant about the poetry being written today. And one of Poetry magazine's goals was to change that. So many people's lives were changed because of Poetry magazine, because it was where they first were able to share their poems. If Poetry magazine had never existed, then it is likely that many of these poets wouldn't have ever had a place to share their poems, and they never would have become as famous as they ever became. Many of them probably wouldn't have ever become poets. About 1/3 of the work submitted and published in Poetry magazine was and continues to be from new poets. Poetry magazine has had such an incredible impact on so many people. It is impossible to imagine how different things would be now if it had never existed. Before Poetry magazine, there was no magazine dedicated completely to poetry, and that caused people to not be able to publish anywhere. Poetry magazine changed a lot of things. So many poems that were first published in Poetry magazine have continued to be read and loved to this day. Just a few of them are Carl Sandburg's Chicago poem, which he wrote as a tribute to the city, We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks, who Poetry magazine first discovered, along with one specific poem which really helped to make Poetry magazine famous, The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. Harriet Monroe first heard of this poem from a foreign correspondent of hers, and as it was the first magazine to publish this poem, Poetry magazine gained much publicity from it. Here is an excerpt from it. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. Poetry magazine is important to us now because if it had never existed, many of the poets we know and love today wouldn't ever have made it to where they ended up, and it's likely that we wouldn't have ever gotten to hear or read their poetry. When Harriet Monroe tragically passed away in Peru in 1936, many people were agonizing over the possibility that Poetry magazine might shut down and never publish again. But, thanks to their many readers and contributors, it has been able to keep running to this day. It was very difficult to raise enough money to continue to award prizes to poets and to pay contributors of the magazine, and at one dark time, only $100 remained in their bank. It managed to pull through, though, by hosting many annual fundraisers for Poetry magazine, such as Poetry Day, which was organized in 1955 by Henry Rago. In 1986, Ruth Lilly endowed the Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, which started as a $25,000 and is now a $100,000 prize given annually. Since then, the Modern Poetry Association, which is Poetry magazine's advisory board, has turned into Poetry Foundation, a non-profit organization. Starting in 2017, Poetry Foundation partnered with the Illinois Humanities to create the Gwendolyn Brooks Youth Poetry Awards, which now runs yearly to help showcase the work of young poets as Poetry magazine began to do over 100 years ago. Poetry magazine also led to the decision that the Writers' Museum would be built in Chicago. Poetry magazine was an instrumental part of creating the world of poetry in Chicago that we know today.